The recruits would remember that morning for the rest of their careers, not because of the wind that howled across the desert range or the targets that most of them failed to hit, but because of the moment a quiet instructor in her late 20s was mocked for looking too young, and the moment they later discovered she carried 11 confirmed kills in her service record. It started just after sunrise at a remote military training range in the Nevada desert, where a class of newly selected recruits had been sent for advanced marksmanship evaluation. The air was dry and cold, the kind that carried sound for miles, and the mountains in the distance were painted gold by the rising sun. The recruits stood in a long line beside their rifles, some stretching their shoulders, others whispering nervously as they waited for the instructor to arrive. This was supposed to be one of the toughest assessments in their entire training pipeline, and rumors had been circulating all week about the instructor who ran the course, some legendary veteran sniper who had trained special operations teams for years. Carter Hayes, one of the loudest recruits in the class, leaned against the bench beside his rifle and smirked at the others. "I heard the guy who runs this place once made a shot at over 1,000 meters, he said confidently. Apparently, he washed out half the last class. A few recruits nodded with a mix of excitement and anxiety. Nobody wanted to be the one who failed in front of a legend. Minutes passed, the wind picked up across the valley, and then footsteps echoed behind them. When the instructor stepped onto the firing line, the reaction wasn't what anyone expected. Instead of an older war veteran with gray hair and a hardened face, the person walking toward them looked barely older than some of the recruits themselves. She was a woman in her late 20s with calm eyes, dark hair pulled into a tight bun, and a plain tactical uniform that carried the name taped Vance across her chest. The recruits glanced at each other, confused at first, then amused. Carter raised an eyebrow and whispered just loud enough for the others nearby to hear. "That can't be the instructor." A couple of the recruits chuckled quietly. One muttered, "Maybe she's the assistant." But Sergeant Mara Vance didn't react to the whispers. She simply walked down the firing line, her boots crunching lightly against the gravel as she inspected each rifle with quick, practiced movements. There was something about the way she handled the weapons that suggested familiarity, like someone who had done it thousands of times before, but most of the recruits were too distracted by their assumptions to notice. Carter folded his arms as she approached him. "Morning," she said calmly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried authority in a way that made even the wind seem to quiet down for a moment. Carter nodded casually. "Morning." She examined his rifle, adjusted the sling slightly, and moved on without another word. Once she passed, Carter leaned toward the recruit beside him. "No offense," he whispered, "but she looks like she should still be in training herself." The recruit beside him snorted softly, trying not to laugh. Down the line, another recruit quietly asked, "Is she seriously running the course?" None of them realized that two senior officers were watching everything from a glass observation tower overlooking the range. Inside the tower, Colonel Daniel Whitaker stood beside the base commander with his arms crossed. He had already noticed the smirks spreading down the line. "They're doing it again," the colonel said under his breath. The commander glanced at him knowingly. "Every class does." Back on the firing line, Sergeant Vance finished her inspection and stepped to the center of the range. "Listen up," she said evenly. The recruits straightened instinctively. "Today's evaluation will test your ability to engage targets at extended range under variable wind conditions. Your first drill will be a 900-meter target engagement." Several recruits exchanged glances. 900 meters was no joke, especially with the desert winds swirling unpredictably through the valley. Vance continued calmly, explaining the wind patterns across the range, the importance of breath control, and how each recruit would only get one shot for the first attempt. Her explanation was clear and precise, but Carter barely listened. Instead, he leaned toward the recruit next to him again. "I bet she's reading that from a manual," he whispered. A couple of the others nearby struggled to suppress their laughter. When Vance finished speaking, she looked across the line, her expression calm and unreadable. "Any questions?" she asked. Carter raised his hand slowly, a half-smile on his face. "Yes, Sergeant," he said. "Have you actually run this course before?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Several recruits looked down, realizing the tone wasn't exactly respectful, but curiosity kept them silent. Vance met Carter's eyes without blinking. "Yes," she replied simply. Carter shrugged. "Just wondering," he said. 900 meters is pretty serious shooting. A faint breeze swept across the range, rustling the flags that marked the wind direction along the valley. For a brief moment, it looked like Vance might say something else. Instead, she turned slightly and gestured toward the targets far in the distance, small steel plates barely visible against the rocky hillside. "It is," she said quietly. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "which is why we're starting there." The recruits moved into position behind their rifles, adjusting bipods and checking scopes as the wind continued to push across the open desert. Carter settled behind his rifle and glanced sideways at the others, still wearing that confident smirk. To him, this was just another training exercise, and the young instructor walking calmly along the firing line still didn't seem like someone worth taking seriously. What Carter didn't know was that Sergeant Mara Vance had already taken shots farther than this, in places where the targets shot back. And somewhere inside the command tower above them, a colonel was quietly waiting for the moment when the recruits would finally realize who they had been laughing at all morning. The moment that truly changed the mood on the range began with a single shot that echoed across the desert valley. The wind had grown stronger as the drill continued, pushing across the Nevada training range in sharp, unpredictable gusts. Small flags along the range snapped constantly, making the 900-meter shot far more difficult than the recruits expected. One by one, they stepped up to the firing line and attempted the shot. The first recruit fired and missed wide. The second tried to adjust for the wind, but still struck the dirt several meters short. A third came close enough to make the target sway slightly, but the clear metallic ring everyone wanted to hear never came. Frustration slowly spread through the group as more shots failed to land. Carter Hayes watched the attempts with growing impatience. He had been confident he would do better than the others. When his turn came, he dropped behind the rifle and lined up the distant steel plate through his scope. The wind pushed hard across the valley. Carter adjusted slightly, exhaled, and pulled the trigger. The rifle cracked sharply. Through his scope, he saw the round kick up dust several feet to the right of the target. Another miss. Carter sat back with a frustrated sigh. "Wind's ridiculous," he muttered before glancing towards Sergeant Mara Vance, standing nearby, calmly observing the line. A smirk crept across his face again. "Maybe you should show us how it's done, Sergeant." A few recruits chuckled quietly. The remark hung in the air for a moment before Vance stepped forward without showing any irritation. "All right," she said simply. Curiosity spread across the firing line as she approached the rifle Carter had just used. The range officer called out the wind reading. "Crosswind, 12 miles per hour." Vance knelt behind the rifle and looked downrange. Instead of rushing the shot, she studied the valley ahead, the wind flags, the drifting dust, the subtle movement of the air across the ground. Slowly, she made a small adjustment to the scope before settling the rifle against her shoulder. She took one controlled breath, held it halfway, and fired. The shot echoed across the range, and almost instantly the distant steel plate rang with a sharp metallic clang. Dead center. The sound bounced off the hills and rolled back across the valley. For a few seconds, the recruits simply stared. Carter tried to shrug it off. "Nice shot," he admitted. "Probably a lucky correction." Vance stood up calmly and handed the rifle back to him. "The wind always tells you when to shoot," she said evenly before continuing down the line as if nothing unusual had happened. But the mood among the recruits had shifted slightly. A few began watching her more carefully now, noticing how she read the wind and studied the range before giving instructions. Carter, however, still wasn't convinced. During the short break between drills, he leaned toward another recruit and laughed quietly. "Still thinks she's too young to be running this place," he said. Unfortunately for him, his voice carried farther than he realized. Several instructors nearby heard the remark, and so did the officers watching from the observation tower above the range. Inside the tower, Colonel Whitaker sighed as he watched the recruits below. "They're still at it," he muttered. The base commander glanced towards Sergeant Vance, calmly instructing the class as if she hadn't heard a word. "You want to step in?" the commander asked. Whitaker shook his head slowly. "Not yet," he replied. Then he looked back at the firing line. "But if they keep talking, it might be time to remind them who their instructor really is." Down on the range, the recruits had no idea that conversation had just taken place, or that before the day ended, Sergeant Mara Vance's record would silence the entire firing line. By the end of the day, The recruits would realize that the most important lesson on that range had nothing to do with wind calculations or marksmanship. It had to do with the danger of judging someone before knowing their story. The final drill had just finished, and the recruits stood beside their rifles while the desert wind continued to sweep across the valley. Some were exhausted, others frustrated by their performance, but a few were still whispering quietly among themselves. Carter Hayes leaned against the bench again, shaking his head slightly as he watched Sergeant Mara Vance speaking with one of the range staff. "Still crazy they've got someone that young running this course," he muttered to the recruit beside him. Unfortunately for Carter, this time the remark didn't go unnoticed. A voice suddenly called out from behind the line, "That'll be enough." The recruits turned quickly as two senior officers walked onto the range from the direction of the observation tower. The moment they recognized Colonel Whitaker, everyone snapped to attention. The colonel stepped forward slowly, his sharp gaze moving down the line before stopping briefly on Carter. "I understand there's been some discussion today about Sergeant Vance's experience," he said calmly. No one spoke. The colonel then turned slightly toward the range officer, standing nearby. "Bring the file." The officer opened a small folder and began reading aloud so the entire firing line could hear. Sergeant Mara Vance. Special Reconnaissance Sniper Unit. 3 overseas deployments. The recruits exchanged quick glances, their earlier confidence beginning to fade. The officer continued. Operational record includes multiple long-range engagements under hostile conditions. Then he paused briefly before reading the line that made the entire range fall silent. Confirmed enemy eliminations, 11. For a moment, the only sound was the wind moving across the desert. Carter felt his stomach drop as the meaning of those words settled over the group. 11 confirmed kills meant something very specific in military records. It meant she wasn't just an instructor. She was a combat sniper who had faced situations far beyond anything the recruits had experienced. The colonel stepped forward again. "Those 11 engagements," he said, "saved the lives of more than 40 American soldiers during her deployments." He gestured towards Sergeant Vance, who stood calmly beside the range staff as if the conversation had nothing to do with her. And she completed her first combat tour at 24 years old. The recruits stared at her in stunned silence. Carter felt his face grow hot as he realized the person he had been joking about all morning had more real combat experience than anyone in his class. The colonel looked back at the group. "Out there," he said quietly, pointing toward the distant mountains beyond the range. "The enemy doesn't care how old someone looks. They only care who's better trained." He paused for a moment before adding, "You'd do well to remember that." The recruits were dismissed shortly afterward. As they began packing up their gear, Carter hesitated before walking over to Sergeant Vance. For a second, he struggled to find the words. "Sergeant, I owe you an apology," he finally said. "I shouldn't have said those things earlier." Vance studied him for a moment before giving a small nod. "Just focus on your training," she replied calmly. Then she added one final piece of advice before turning back toward the range. "Skill doesn't come with gray hair. It comes from experience you can't always see." Carter watched her walk away, realizing that the quiet instructor he had underestimated that morning had just taught him the most valuable lesson of the entire course. And long after the targets were packed up and the recruits left the desert range behind, the story of the day they mocked a sniper with 11 confirmed kills would continue to be told to every new class that arrived there.